Christopher Smout is almost certainly Scotland's best known and most highly acclaimed historian. He has an apparently inexhaustible range of interests within the fields of economic and social history, trade, agriculture and rural society, demography, poverty and living standards, and nationalism and national identity, to name but a few. He is the author of numerous articles and several books, most notably A History of the Scottish People, and more recently, A Century of the Scottish People. Although most of Chris's published work has related to Scotland, his interests have never been confined to Scotland. The Scotland of which he writes has always been part of Northern Europe and the wider world. And this, I think, is one of a number of reasons why his work has attracted so much interest and admiration not only within Scotland, but also much further afield. Chris, throughout your career, you have remained a remarkably private man. But I wonder if you could say something very briefly about your early background, your life before going to Cambridge, the influences on you.
Surely. I was the youngest of 5 sons. And my father was an industrialist and very much a late Victorian self-made man. He was the son of a colliery clerk who'd got a job in Kynek's munitions factory. And in the late Victorian way, he got his son, my father, into the factory. And my father then went to night school and in due course made his way in the world through this. Kynek's was taken over by ICI and he became ultimately a director of ICI. And my mother was a farmer's daughter, daughter of a fairly prosperous dairy farmer on the outskirts of Birmingham in the late 19th century, when it paid both to have milk and land on the outskirts of Birmingham. So I was brought up in Birmingham and went to school, a prep school in Birmingham, and then went to a public school, the Lees School in Cambridge. And from there I went to Clare College, Cambridge.
At what stage did you develop an interest in history? I mean,
yeah, it was jolly early. I am not quite sure, but certainly when I was at school, we had a very, very good history master who, once you got your sort of standard school certificate, as it was in those days, really relaxed about what he was doing and sort of went out of his way to make history interesting and broad, and encouraged us to do things like local history and things like that. I became absorbed also in the local history of the farm which my father had bought in Worcestershire, South Worcestershire. And there it had a medieval history, and I used to read the Victoria County history of Worcestershire and things like that. A lot of fun.
So you had an early start.
I had an early start in that way.
Right, and you went to Cambridge to study history?
I did, yes, that's right.
Right. Well, you were at Cambridge, as I understand it, in the 1950s.
Right.
Now, I can't imagine that much Scottish history was taught there, and you're an Englishman to boot. So what was it that inspired your interest in Scottish history? Was this as an undergraduate that this developed, or perhaps was it because you were looking for a PhD topic?
Well, I'll tell you the story because it shows how important things to me personally arrive from utterly trivial causes. My tutor in Cambridge was the very distinguished Geoffrey Elton, and one of the things about Geoffrey Elton is that he is a very dominant personality. And I, in due course, got my degree, in which I'd learnt no Scottish history at all, had no interest in Scotland. I couldn't even have told you the date of the Act of Union, you see. And Geoffrey wasn't a man to encourage much study of Scottish history, but then neither did the whole system in Cambridge do so. And I decided I very much liked to do research in history, but I was completely unclear as to where or what this research should focus on. And I went to see Professor Elton, and he suggested that there were still some minor topics in the foreign policy of Henry VIII, which interested him, and maybe I would care to study that.
Mm-hmm.
And some sort of self-defense mechanism instantly triggered, and I could see that if I did that, I would not do what I really wished to do.
Yeah.
I would do what Geoffrey Elton wished me to do.
Yeah.
And much as I respect Geoffrey Elton, I didn't actually wish to do that. So I said, no, I was really interested, I said, in trade.
Mm-hmm.
And that was more or less grabbed out of the air, although I had enjoyed what economic history I was taught in Cambridge.
Who had taught it?
Saltmarsh was the lecturer at that time to history students.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't an economic history student, I was a straight history tripos. And we didn't get very much, but we got Saltmarsh, and we got Chetland, and Charles Wilson, too. Charles Wilson, admirable. And when I said this, Geoffrey very reasonably said, well, trade with where?
Mm-hmm.
So I said, well, I wasn't very sure.
Mm-hmm.
And there was rather a awkward silence. He said, well, maybe you better come back next week and talk about it. Yeah. So I went back, feeling very silly. And I had a very good friend who was Yorkshireman I shared a room with at Clare College.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, it's perfectly simple. Do you prefer blondes or brunettes?
Mm-hmm.
So I said, I prefer blondes. And he said, well, it's Scandinavia. He said, otherwise it would have been Italy. And it seemed to me to be as good an answer as any.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to Professor Elton and said that I would like to do the history of trade between Denmark and England in the 16th and 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one of those awful silences where I felt he could see exactly into my soul and how shallow was my thinking.
Yeah.
But he accepted all this. And he then sent me to discuss this strange idea with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And he arranged that I should go down to London and join Ragnhilda Hatton, a lecturer in London University who was a Scandinavian expert. After dinner, which he was having a dinner with the great T.S. Ashton and Astrid Friis, who was the leading Danish historian of trade.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really to get Astrid Friis's advice about this, you see. So I went down and came in with a coffee like the after eights, and they were extremely nice to me, these three very distinguished historians.
Mm-hmm.
And Astrid Friis said, why do you want to study English history? Very boring. What you should do is to study Scottish history, because there's a lot of contact between Scandinavia and Scotland, which has never been looked at in that period. And it came like a flash to me, that. It was a wonderful idea, because I could spend half my time in Scandinavia and half my time in Scotland, and rather little time in Cambridge, where I felt I'd been quite a long time, because I'd been to school there. You see.
Sure.
So that was how I became a Scottish historian.
You mentioned, you referred there to the choice you had to make between blondes and brunettes.
Yes.
What, I'm sure there's something.
There was a
here as
sequel
well.
to that, you see, because I then had to learn Danish. And I remember sitting in hall in college and saying to my friends that I was going to go to the Scandinavian Society dance in order to pick up a Danish girl who would teach me Danish, you see. And the strategy was entirely successful. And we've been married now happily for about 33 years.
Good.
So that all worked out nice.
Right. Well, the book which resulted from your thesis was Scottish Trade on the Eve of the Union, and that was rightly acclaimed as it filled a great gap in Scottish economic history and brought forward the work of Edgar Lyth on the 16th century. Was it that, though, that brought you north to Edinburgh? Was it simply that an academic post came up, or were you by this time determined to work in Scotland, or at least on Scottish history?
By that time I was determined to work on Scottish history. And you don't have any choice where a job might come. And I would have gone anywhere, as I was getting married that summer and would have, me and a wife to support. And I was incredibly lucky that a job came up in Edinburgh at exactly that time, just as I was finishing my PhD. And so I went to Edinburgh. And that was wonderful.
Yeah. During the 60s, after you'd arrived
Yeah.
in Edinburgh, you broadened your interests and moved forward to some extent into the 18th century and into the question of Scotland's economic transformation.
Yes.
You began to write about landowners
Yes.
and so on. What I want to ask about now is what took you toward your next major project and the book which you're probably best known for, and that is A History of the Scottish People from 1560 to 1830. I mean, there's a sense in which this transformed the study of Scottish history and has inspired, as you know, countless readers and many researchers since. Were you conscious when you approached that topic? Well, can you tell us what took you into it in the first place?
Yes. What took me into it was a letter from Richard Allard, who was working for Collins in those days. And Richard was and is a historian of the 17th century. And in the course of doing his reading, he'd read the book on Scottish trade, and he liked it. And he thought the first chapter, which was sort of rather general in its tone, might indicate that I would be prepared to write something of a general nature, you see. And he wrote to me and asked if I would be interested in doing a one-volume social history of Scotland. And I thought this was very exciting because I was at that time reading extensively later than the 17th century. I was doing a lot of work in the 18th century because I was very interested in landowners and things. And my colleagues in Edinburgh were 18th century people, at least Michael Flynn was an 18th century person, and there were others whom I was close to. And so I found that exciting, and I found the challenge of trying to write a general social history very exciting because there hadn't really been one of Scotland before. But it took an incredibly long time. I'm not a quick writer at all. I'm not a quick worker. And I think it took about 7 years before, from Richard's first letter until it came out. And I was absolutely convinced on the day it was published that they had made a terrible mistake and that there was no way in which this was going to sell any copies at all.
Well, you were wrong.
I was wrong, yes, happily.
I mean, you although you say that a social history hadn't been written, I mean, you do in your preface to that book make very kind remarks about, say, people like Henry Graham.
Oh, yes,
I mean,
yes.
were you conscious that you were doing something different? Were you conscious of the significance? Did you have any idea of the significance of what that work was?
No, I didn't really. I mean, I greatly admired Henry Graham when you consider that was written in 1899. The first edition is 1899. And although now it reads as a very slanted and old-fashioned book, it was very much a source-based book. And I wanted to write something which seemed to me to respect the sources and all the secondary scholarship that had gone on in Scotland since then. I won't say to update Henry Graham because I had a different aim in mind, obviously, because it was covering a different thing. But that's what I saw myself doing. And I saw myself trying to write a history of Scotland which was not political in its focus and not merely economic in its content. So something which would be, in a sense, a general history, but focused firmly on the social development of the country.
Yeah. Given the state of Scottish historical writing in the 1950s and 60s, the great gaps there were in knowledge about so many topics, and I suppose the highly coloured nature of so much of the secondary literature, much of it which was Victorian, it must have been a difficult book to write. I mean, how did you go about it, given, as I say, that there was so little, relatively little, secondary material around, and much that had been produced, 50, 60, 70, 80 years beforehand?
Well, I went about it in a fairly sort of systematic, beginning way. And I think the least successful part of it is the first chapter, which is about the Middle Ages, where I depended entirely upon secondary reading. I mean, good quality Scottish medieval history was being written then, and I mined it, but it wasn't really social and economic in its focus. And I was further removed from the sources at that point than in any subsequent chapter. The idea was originally that I should go on to the present day, but I'd already written more than enough by the time I got to 1830, and I felt like I'd run out of puff. So I wrote to Richard and said, you know, sorry, but I'm not going to write anymore. And he said, but you'll do another volume. So I wrote in the end of the first volume that I would do another one, a thing which for many years I regretted, because it was, I think, 13 years between then and then being able to produce A Century of the Scottish People.
Was it easier to write The Century of the Scottish People, where you could draw on a much more substantial body of secondary material?
It would have been almost impossible to write a satisfactory Century of the Scottish People when I just finished the history of the Scottish people, because I did depend on that 13 years scholarship which other people did. And so in that sense it was easier to write. In other senses it was less easy to write, because my own mind had changed. My own views of what history is about had changed between the two. I had a fairly clear-cut view, you know, a very Whig view when I wrote the history of the Scottish people. By the time I wrote the Century of the Scottish people, I was much more uncertain as what was an appropriate content for social history.
I think that comes over. But like virtually all your writing, both the history of Scottish people and the Century of the Scottish people are, in spite of the fact that you had some ideas there, or big ideas if you like, they are refreshingly free from jargon and dogma. Now obviously your writing is informed by the social sciences, you are a social scientist. But what theory there is rarely, it seems to me anyway, really intrudes. Now is this deliberate? Is this a conscious decision on your part, perhaps to make your work more accessible to a wider audience? Or is it perhaps that you just don't like theory or history which is heavily laden with theory?
It's a bit of both. I don't like history which is heavily laden with theory. To me it makes, however good the history is, to me the theory often intrudes, and I would rather that the theory was maybe stated, but and maybe a backbone for it, but no more than a backbone. The other thing is that, see, I was not brought up as a social scientist. I had no training in Cambridge in economics. I had no training in Cambridge in sociology. I had no training in Cambridge about theory of any sort at all. I mean, history was more or less what happened. And when I came to an economic history department, as I did, I felt in many ways very inadequately prepared. I felt there were whole areas for which I was not properly qualified to teach, which was indeed true. And so partly the absence of theory is because I didn't know enough to be confident in its use.
Sure.
But at the same time, I do enjoy, despite what I've just said, I do enjoy ideas in history. I mean, I have found Marxist ideas, although I'm not a Marxist, to be almost invariably challenging. You know, if I disagree, I have to work out why I disagree.
But yet there doesn't seem to be much, at least I can't see a great Marxist influence in any of your work.
No.
I mean, do you consciously reject it?
No, I don't consciously reject it. I mean, I think the history of class is absolutely fascinating, as a matter of fact. I think the history of how groups of people treat one another and how their relationships are articulated is absolutely at the core of history. And in that sense, I feel very close to Marxists. It's the kind of rigour, maybe I'd say straitjacket, which I think they tend to force things which I react against. Sometimes perhaps overreact against.
Who then were the major influences on your historical writing, thinking?
I think if you go back to Cambridge, Geoffrey Elton was certainly one. He was a very rigorous tutor, and I remember giving an essay in, and he handed it back to me with a comment that you show your usual ability to conceal what you do not know. And he, many a time, I have crossed off a page because I realised that I was doing just that. You know, there's a kind of standard.
Yes.
And the other one was Marjorie Chibnall, who was a tutor there, a medieval historian. And I recall her getting totally carried away with the excitement of history, and suddenly turning to me and saying, "Tell me, Mr. Smout, have you read the Hungarian sources?" And the idea that a tutor could reasonably expect somebody to have read the Hungarian sources suddenly made me realise there was no limit to this game. You know. It wasn't a matter of the set books, it was just no limit to it. And it was a strange question, but intellectually, that was the question that you would ask. And so...
so that was the rigour, if you like.
That's the rigour, yes. Those two I've often felt encapsulated a lot. Also, when I was at Cambridge, I did a medieval special subject under Dom David Knowles, was the life of St Bernard and the Cistercian order. And although it resembled in no way, obviously, in no obvious respect, the sort of work I've done since, he had the sort of mind which drew in everything. You know, he was interested in the legal history of the order, but also in the architecture of the order, and in the social history of the monasteries, and the theology which underpinned it all. And it was immensely exciting for that reason. And I've often thought that I gained far more from that than I probably realised at the time in defining what history was. When I came to Edinburgh, I was very blessed in having two colleagues, Michael Flynn and Alan Millward, and we were all appointed within a year of one another. And it was a golden age in my life in terms of intellectual excitement. And we used to sit in the Edinburgh Staff Club for maybe a couple of hours at lunchtime and simply talk about the things that we were teaching. I mean, problems that we were teaching that we didn't fully understand, and we would talk them all through, and it was extraordinarily stimulating. And both those two scholars had great influence on me.
Sure.
Michael, I think especially, again because of the breadth of his interests and the passion with which he pursued knowledge, and the complete integrity of his character, I thought was superb. Later on, I think I was very greatly influenced by reading E.P. Thompson. I think that made a great change in the way in which I came to perceive history. And
had you read that before you wrote History of the Scottish People? Because you do, I think, in a sense, challenge it in the sense that you say there was no
that's right.
Making of a Scottish working class.
That's right, yes. No, it had been published before then, but a very considerable change came over economic history in the course of the 70s, which had a considerable influence on me, and social history as well. Economic history almost manically pursued the notion of growth. And in fact, our department used to say that the history of what economic history was the story of growth, you see, which was a very Whig approach to do it. And I think that the history of the Scottish people is in a way informed by that approach. It is about progress, if you like, and how it was sort of emerges and how Scotland is modernised, and that is seen to be progress.
And you see that in your work in the 60s on the Union as well.
Yes, that's right.
Very, very much in the same.
Yes, indeed, it's absolutely true. Well, various things happened in the 70s. First of all, British economic history totally lost confidence in itself. It fell to pieces because it could not really solve the problems which it had set up. And it wasn't tremendously sophisticated compared to the new economic history of the Americans. It didn't quite know how to cope with this situation. And I remember feeling very alarmed and even more ill-prepared as the 70s went through. And one was trying to cope with, trying to be at the cutting edge of economic history in Edinburgh, and I felt I was not there. The other thing which I think happened was simply that people began to have doubts all over the world about growth. I mean, it didn't seem to be happening in the same way people anticipated. It seemed to have far more disbenefits than people had appreciated. And social historians began to be interested in other things, and geographers began to be interested in other things. And I think that economic history in Britain has probably been saved by geographers, as a matter of fact, because they began to ask quite different sorts of questions, the sorts of questions that Tony Wrigley was asking, for example, or some of the agrarian historians were asking. It hadn't very much to do with growth. They had to do with society. And they had to do with the disprivileged, but not in a Marxist sense. And they had to do with people's relationships and spatial relationships too. And all these things I thought were very interesting.
So, I mean, you said earlier on that there was that your attitude to society, social change, and so forth, was different when you went about the writing of the Century of the Scottish People as opposed to the history of the Scottish people. What caused that change in your? Well, what can you tell us a bit more about the nature of that change, and what do you think brought that change in your perspective, if you like?
Well, I think it was because I think it's probably two things. First of all, if you look at Scottish history, the theme of modernisation is not so striking, to put it bluntly, between 1830 and 1950, whereas the costs of being an industrial society were very obvious. So that created, as it were, a different agenda to begin with. And so that was part of it. Also, I really became very interested in the costs of industrialisation, just for their own sake, not because there wasn't another theme, but because I was interested in how people perceived themselves and how they reacted in an industrialising society and how they could defend themselves against these things. I think it was a change of interest in that way.
I mean, you have been criticised, I think, for the picture you paint is an accurate one, but you have been criticised for not taking that further in, if you like, a political sense. I mean,
in the second volume?
Yes, in the second volume.
That is true.
I mean, how do you respond to that?
I think I respond to that by saying I didn't really feel that I had the expertise to carry it forward in a political sense. Perhaps I should have done, but it wasn't where my energy and my interests were at that time.
But you have engaged sometimes with Scottish political questions, particularly the question of nationalism and national identity. What took you in this direction or in that direction?
Well, I don't see how one can work in Scotland as a historian, particularly as a historian who tries to be accessible to more than his own colleagues. I don't see how one can work in Scotland without engaging with the problem of identity and with the problem of nationalism. And as I was talking about the Union, from a quite early stage in my academic career, this obviously kept returning to me.
Do you think a historian has a function then in wider society?
Oh yes, I mean, I feel that very strongly indeed, that a historian has a function in wider society and should not be merely writing, or not writing all the time for his colleagues.
Generally, one of the things that I think your public, if you like, likes about your about you is this fact that you seem to enjoy the cut and thrust of historical debate. You believe in the, fervently I would think, in dialogue and what dialogue between historians can produce in positive terms.
Yes, I do, very much so. And I believe also in comparison. I believe that very strongly. I think dialogue is even better when you're talking with somebody who has a different perspective, sometimes from a different country, which is why I've always been interested in making comparisons with Europe or with Ireland, for example.
Can you take us into that a bit? Because I think one of the major contributions, another of your major contributions, has been this getting the Irish-Scottish comparison off the ground with, of course, other people.
Yes.
And you've also worked a fair bit in terms of comparison of Scotland with Scandinavia, especially in the rural area.
Yes.
I mean, can you tell us what took you down that particular
Well, what
route?
took me down that route was the very admirable fact that when I came to Edinburgh University, I wasn't allowed to teach my specialism very much. And we had a second-year course which was dealt with European economic history. And Professor Youngson, who was chairman of the department at that time, said to me, "Your wife's Danish, Christopher. You can teach the Scandinavian side." And I was appalled. But I went away and I produced a set of lectures on Denmark and Norway and Sweden, particularly Denmark, as I had taught myself Danish by that time. And the more I read of this, the more fascinated I was by the existence of a society, in some ways much more like Scotland than England was at that time. And then, largely through coincidental and personal reasons, I got to know Louis Cullen in Dublin. And that gave me another extremely interesting insight. And Louis was exactly the same mind. I mean, his whole view of history was the importance of comparisons between small countries. And we really became excited about this. And I have always felt and continue to feel really quite passionately that Scottish historians must compare themselves with other countries. And if you compare yourself all the time with England, although it's relevant, it's not necessarily the most relevant.
So what has been produced? Well, what for you has been the big achievement of the Scottish-Irish comparative method, or those periodic meetings between Scottish economic social historians and Irish economic social historians?
I think it isn't so much that anybody has come up with a brilliant book or a brilliant article which sets the two societies together and says, there. I think it's much more that it's enters into the bloodstream now of social and economic historians in Scotland, that there's Ireland as well, and that there are other countries as well, and they keep thinking in these ways. That I think is what is emerging out of it.
So it's helped bring Scottish history out of its parochial rut.
Yes, yes, it has. Yes, yes, I think that's right. In most areas, in some areas, quite the contrary. I mean, the whole area of intellectual history, in which I've never played very much part, is nevertheless immensely international. And nobody would dream of talking about the history of the Enlightenment in Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge, or anywhere else without reference to the great Scottish thinker.
Chris, it strikes me that working in Scottish history just now is an extremely interesting and dynamic place to be. You've had the benefit of being in this area now for 30 years or so. What for you are the main differences between the subject as it is now and as it was in the late 50s, early 60s? What's been achieved?
I think the achievements have been enormous and very wide-ranging over almost every area of Scottish history. There's been a renaissance and an explosion of writing. If you just take the centuries that you and I are interested in, sort of 17th century onwards, the increase in the volume of writing on economic and social history is extraordinary. I mean, one really has to pinch oneself to realise how little there was back in 1960.
Sure.
There was nothing published on the 19th century except Marwick's book on economic developments in Victorian Scotland. I mean, it's incredible now.
Yeah. Can you briefly, is it possible briefly to account for that? Is it to do with the expansion of universities, higher education, more people in the research business, or is it something uniquely Scottish, or which you can link to, say, what's happening in Scottish society?
I think you can link it instantly to what's happening in Scottish society. Back in the 50s, people used to talk about a brain drain. If you read interwar accounts of Scotland, there's a terrifically demoralised sense. People like Edwin Muir write in despair of Scotland ever regaining her sense as an intellectual centre. Well, that turned round in a quite remarkable way. That turned completely round. The complaints are not now of brain drain, but too many Englishmen like myself coming in, you see.
You're excused.
I'm excused, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
There is immense vibrancy in Scottish society now, and a very much greater sense of self-confidence within Scotland. And as the self-confidence grows, people don't feel they want to make any excuses studying Scottish history. It's just natural. And if it's natural, then people study it because it's part of their society's life and culture and existence, and so the whole thing has come to life. And that's part of a very big change, I think, in Scottish life.
To take us back specifically into history, there are still great gaps.
Yes.
I mean, for example, we don't have the sort of statistical database of say, Mitchell and Dean for England. What are the other big areas you think that we have to explore?
Well, the statistical one is a very important one, and it's something which I think should be explored and should be on the agenda of the Economic Socialist Society of Scotland to explore. So there's certainly that. What interests me very much, actually, is the history of people's consciousness, their answers to the question, who do I think I am? Now, this, of course, has been central to a lot of Marxist history, particularly since E.P. Thompson really posed this about class. But it isn't just about class. In Scotland, it's also about nationality. To really explore subtly the nature of Scottish identity, I think, is a great and very difficult task for a social historian to undertake, and one that will need all sorts of subtle tools to explore in terms of content analysis of language and things like this. I think there's a lot of questions about identity, about relationships between groups which still need teasing out, and I think they're good questions.
I referred earlier to we talked earlier about your wide range of interests, and that last topic you mentioned is an indication of an increasingly wide range of interests. You've recently become director of the Institute for Environmental History in St Andrews, and presumably this is another path-breaking road that you're going to make, so to speak. Can you tell us where this comes from and where this is going?
Yes. I retired from my chair in Scottish history 2 years ago, as you know, and at the same time I became involved with the new body, Scottish Natural Heritage, which is an amalgamation of the old Countryside Commission for Scotland and Nature Conservancy Council. And this made me very aware that the environment has a history, and that this history is fundamentally misrepresented, unwittingly misrepresented by many people who are actually interested in the environment, and that the history of the environment is almost unexplored and goes back within Scotland 10,000 years.
Sure.
And the impact of man on the landscape and man's changing relationship to nature is, I think, a smashing historical question, which has not been investigated. Well, I didn't think the idea of environmental history up off my head.
Sure.
Very influential in formulating my thoughts. It would be a good idea to try and create a little point of energy in Scotland about this, were the works of Oliver Rackham in Corpus College in Cambridge, who's a botanist and historian who's written about the history of the countryside in England, and particularly about the history of woods.
Yeah.
And I found his work very inspiring. But the intention of it is both to explore these themes. I mean, what happened to the environment when they introduced sheep? You know, we know what happened to the people, and there's been excellent writing about that. But what about the environment itself? Is it really degraded by centuries of misuse? What is the effect of the Industrial Revolution on all that? Did it accelerate, or did it in some ways retard what had been an earlier tradition of misuse by giving a value to some of the things, say timber, which it hadn't had before? There's a whole range of questions there, and I find that it's taking me back in time horizons in areas where I'm thoroughly incompetent and therefore need to talk to archaeologists and geographers and pollen analysts, and that's very exciting.
So as 20 years or so you picked up social scientific techniques, you're now going to pick up the techniques of pollen analysis.
Well, I'm not going to practice the techniques of pollen
but
analysis, because for that I would have to have a large lab and be totally re-educated. But I'm understanding how pollen analysis carries you forward in a very surprising and fascinating way.
You in your work you use a tremendous range of tools, if you like, and borrow very heavily and admirably from a wide range of disciplines. Has this always been your method?
Yes, I've always enjoyed thinking in different ways. And I do think historians don't probably take on enough different ways of, don't use a wide enough range of tools that they could use. I think we were rather slow to take up oral history, actually, in Scotland. And those who did practice oral history rather kept it in a little pocket by itself, rather than trying to integrate it with the rest of Scottish history. And now I'm much more interested in museums than I used to be, and I can see the interest of material culture in all this sort of thing.
Well, Chris, you've recently retired from your chair of Scottish history, but you clearly haven't retired from the Scottish history business.
No way.
And I wish you all the very best in the future.
Thank you very much.